Hello, I am Shane Brinkman Davis Delamore, and this is Code and Optimism, yet another episode of Solving Problems Faster with Software. Today's topic is the Campfire Principle, also known as the Boy Scout Rule. It starts with this quote: "Try and leave this world a little better than you found it." This is a quote by Robert Baden-Powell, the Boy Scouts founder in 1941. And you can see why this became the Boy Scout rule. This concept of, the Boy Scouts going camping, and when you're at the campground, if it's a little bit messy beforehand, you clean it up and you leave it nicer than when you found it. And this has been long applied to code as well. So let's dive into it just a little bit. So I happen to just like the term the Campfire Principle. That's how I first learned it. It's called the Campfire Principle, even though I think most people call it the Boy Scout rule. I like to say it as this: leave the code better than you found it. And what that really means is when you're doing normal work, you might be fixing a bug, you might be adding a new feature. When you're in there, you should look for little opportunities to improve code as you go. In fact, that should just be part of your modus operandi. Whenever you're working in the code, you're always working on making small little improvements. And the key thing here is that they should be objective code quality improvements, which means you should have some sense of what your objective code quality measurements are. If you're working as a team, you should define that for the team. Now, I just did an episode on code quality, which I'll certainly link to below. I didn't get too much into objective code quality measurements. I had some general thoughts about that, but we'll get into that more in another episode. But nonetheless, you should have ways of actually defining what code quality means for your team. And remember, code quality always means refactorability. So how are you going to measure the ability to do refactors, code edits? When you're doing the Campfire Principle, I've got a few thoughts on a few do's and don'ts. So the key do's are staying focused on what you're already doing. I'm assuming you're processing an issue from your issue tracker, but whether you're more formal or less formal, you're working on some work. And only touch the files that you're editing to work on that issue anyway. And often I will do these little code edits directly in service. So like I'm adding a new capability and then I see an opportunity to dry up some code. Like now I've got two different versions of this function. They both do a similar thing. I'll dry them up, merge them together, and maybe parameterize them to choose the two options, or maybe it'll just get cleaned up entirely. So stay focused on your issue. Only edit the same files that your issue needs you to edit. If you are starting to edit other files just for the code cleanup part, the Campfire Principle, you should probably just stop right there. That's probably going beyond working on your issue and doing the Campfire Principle. It's kind of like if you go to the campground and you go and you start to camp and you notice that the neighbor's campground is messy. Sure, you could start going around all the various campgrounds around you and cleaning them all out. There's a place for that. But that's a little different from the Campfire Principle. That's a little bit more, you're going out into the world to improve things. The last thing is, as we mentioned before, keep it objective. Don't just do what feels good. Have some sense of what objective code quality is. And I'll give you a little tip for me. My perspective is code quality is closely connected to code size. And so if I'm reducing, and I measure that in terms of tokens, if I'm reducing the code size in terms of the number of tokens, I generally believe that is improving code quality. That is a topic for another episode. Let's talk about some don'ts. The big thing is don't start refactoring, and that is that aspect of starting to touch multiple files. So as I defined in the previous episodes on refactoring, also linked below, a refactor is when you're touching multiple modules. It's when you're touching multiple files. That is a different thing than the Campfire Principle. The key thing about the Campfire Principle is it's cheap. It's high value for effort. You should be feeling like I'm putting 10% additional effort above the solving the issue that I'm working on, whatever it might be, and I'm making a non-trivial improvement to the code. So it's really easy to do, it doesn't cost a lot, and I'm moving things forward. Once you starting to spend more effort, more than like 10% of the overall effort on this code cleanup, then you're more in the refactoring area. I'm super pro refactoring, but you should separate your refactoring from your other things like bug fixing or feature work, etc. So that's that second bullet there. If you're spending more time cleaning than solving, then you know you're going the wrong direction. Generally, your cleaning should be probably 10% of your whatever you're working on. Last thing, and this is similar, is don't make big PRs. So if you're working with a team or if you're just using the exercise of doing pull requests for yourself, it's really, really important that each PR be focused on the issue that it's tied to. So if you're fixing a bug, all of the files in that should be tied to that bug so that whoever's reviewing the PRs can say, does this make sense for solving this bug? If you start touching a whole bunch of other files, or perhaps if your files are larger, if you start touching a whole bunch of different parts of those files that are very incidental to your bug, then you're going to make that PR reviewer's job a real hassle. And that's, one, it's just nice to them to make it easier for them, and that might be yourself, but it's also going to make their job harder to do well. So they might screw it up and not do as well because you made a big PR. Separate it up into 2 PRs. And consider the other one refactoring. And I'll talk about that just a second here. So now I want to put this in this broader concept of a spectrum of various levels of code quality work. So I've talked a lot about refactoring in the last 3 episodes. Refactoring is kind of that middle spot. And I wouldn't say it's a sweet spot. It's pretty broad in terms of the range of complexity. At the beginning of the refactoring complexity section is when you're editing multiple modules, multiple files. And the Campfire Principle is below that in terms of complexity. It's pretty much everything below a refactor. So something that is just touching the files that you're already touching anyway. Maybe it's only one file. Maybe it's a tiny little bit. It's a small amount of effort, small amount of risk, high reward, low hanging fruit. That's the Campfire Principle. Then you got Refactor, which goes from anywhere above that where you're touching multiple files and you're doing it for the explicit intention of improving code quality, not just for solving whatever issue you're working on, all the way up to and stopping just before the total rewrite. So the total rewrite is when you are throwing everything away and starting from scratch. That's sort of the concept of the total rewrite. But you might reuse chunks of code in total rewrite, but you're rewriting substantial portions of your code. And that's beyond a refactor. Typically that involves changing external interfaces, breaking external interfaces, or changing the UX for the end user. That's the high end of the spectrum. And we haven't talked about that yet, but that will be for a future episode. So with that, I'll say thank you again for spending your valuable time with me. I know that you've got lots of valuable uses of your time, and I very much appreciate you watching these episodes with me. I will also ask you about your experience with the Campfire Principle. First of all, do you like the Boy Scout rule term or Campfire Principle? Do you like Campfire Principle? What phrase do you like to use this from? How did you first learn about this? When you're applying the Campfire Principle, have you ever seen it gone awry? What stories do you have around when it didn't work? What are your thoughts along those lines of Campfire Principle? Where have you seen it work? Where have you seen it not work? Please put your comments down below. I would love to have a conversation. And with that, I will just say, remember, all problems are solvable with enough knowledge.